In 1884, a woman stepped off a train in San Jose, California, carrying nothing but grief and a fortune so vast it could reshape the earth itself. Sarah Winchester, widow of the gun magnate William Wirt Winchester, arrived in the Santa Clara Valley not to build a home, but to construct an answer to a question that had broken her. Why had everyone she loved been taken from her? Her infant daughter Annie, dead at 6 weeks from marasmus, a wasting disease that slowly consumed the child, while Sarah watched helplessly. Her husband William, dead at 43 from tuberculosis, coughing blood in their New Haven mansion, while the fortune from repeating rifles accumulated in vaults he would never open again. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company had transformed American warfare, had put a rifle in the hands of every settler, every soldier, every man who wanted the power to kill at a distance. 15 shots without reloading. The gun that won the West. The gun that slaughtered Buffalo by the millions. The gun that turned the Civil War into industrialized death. The Winchester rifle reshaped warfare and frontier violence on a massive scale. The exact death toll will never be known, but its impact was vast and devastating, spanning military conflicts, indigenous displacement, and countless individual tragedies that were never recorded. Sarah Winchester inherited $20 million, the equivalent of over $550 million today, a fortune built on death that had now consumed its own bloodline. She was 45 years old, childless, widowed, wealthy beyond measure, and completely untethered from meaning. New Haven society expected her to remarry, to retreat into charitable work, to fade into the background as respectable, wealthy widows did. Instead, she traveled to Boston to consult a medium, a spiritualist named Adam Coons, who claimed to communicate with the dead. What he told her became the architecture of her remaining years. The spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking vengeance against her family. That was why Annie had died. Why William had died. Why she would die too, unless she could appease them. The spirits, Coons claimed, wanted her to move west, to build a house for them, and to never stop building. As long as construction continued, the spirits would be confused, unable to find her, unable to complete their revenge. It was nonsense. It was exploitation. It was a ghost story told by a charlatan to a grieving woman with unlimited resources. And Sarah Winchester believed it completely. Or perhaps she simply needed a story that gave her grief a shape, a purpose, a daily ritual that would carry her from morning to night without collapsing into the void. For 38 years, Sarah Winchester would not stop building. The hammers never fell silent. The saws never ceased. And what emerged was not a house, but a monument to madness, guilt, and the impossible mathematics of atonement. The land she purchased in 1886 was a simple 8-room farmhouse on 44 acres of apricot orchards and prune fields, unremarkable in every way except for its distance from everything Sarah had lost. The property had belonged to Dr. Robert Caldwell, a physician who had no idea he was selling to a woman who would transform his modest homestead into one of the strangest structures ever built. San Jose in the 1880s was a frontier town transforming into agricultural wealth, where Spanish land grants met American ambition in a collision of cultures and capital. The Santa Clara Valley, once home to the Tamian Ohlone for thousands of years, had been emptied by mission, disease, and American displacement by the time Sarah arrived. The orchards she walked through had been planted on land taken by force and sold in parcels to whoever had money. Sarah saw none of this history. She saw only space, room to build, room to confuse the dead, room to create something so complex that spirits could wander its corridors forever without finding her. She hired carpenters immediately, paying them $3 a day when the going rate was $1.50, and she gave them a single instruction: never stop. Construction would proceed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the next 38 years. No master plan, no architectural blueprints, no structural engineers consulted about load-bearing walls or foundation requirements. Just her instructions, delivered each morning after her nightly seances in what would become known as the Blue Room, a windowless chamber in the heart of the house where she claimed to receive architectural guidance from benevolent spirits who opposed the vengeful dead. She would enter the Blue Room at midnight, ring a bell to summon the spirits, and communicate with them through the night. The servants, forbidden from entering during these sessions, reported seeing lights flickering under the door, hearing voices, Sarah's and others, that seemed to overlap and echo. Whether she truly believed in the spirits or whether the seances were theater, a performance that gave her solitude and authority, remains unknowable. What is certain is that every morning she emerged with new plans, sketched on scraps of paper or described verbally to foremen who learned not to ask for clarification or logic. The carpenters learned quickly that conventional architectural thinking did not apply. When Sarah ordered a staircase built, they built it, even when it led directly into a ceiling. When she demanded a door installed in an exterior wall 3 feet above the ground with no porch or landing, they installed it. When she wanted a window placed in a floor or a chimney that stopped 3 feet short of the roof, they complied. These men, many of them immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Portugal, and China, had seen difficult bosses before, had worked under demanding conditions, but they had never encountered an employer who seemed to be building from a dream logic that shifted daily. Yet they stayed. The pay was excellent. The work was steady. In an era of economic uncertainty, of boom and bust cycles that could leave a family destitute overnight, the Winchester Mansion represented security. Sarah Winchester was not going to run out of money. She was not going to stop construction. She was, in her own way, offering something rare in the Gilded Age: guaranteed employment for life, if you could tolerate the strangeness. The mansion grew like a tumor, cellular and chaotic, spreading in directions that defied structural sense, but followed a deeper psychological logic. By 1890, just 4 years after purchase, the house had reached 7 stories, a Victorian tower house rising above the orchards like a cathedral to confusion. The original farmhouse had been completely consumed, absorbed into wings and additions that spread like roots. Rooms multiplied through a process that seemed almost biological. One room would be built, then divided, then subdivided, then expanded in a different direction, creating spaces that had no clear function or relationship to the rooms around them. Hallways twisted back on themselves in geometries that defeated navigation. Staircases descended into floors and ascended into ceilings with the same indifference to function, as if vertical and horizontal space were interchangeable concepts. Sarah Winchester was not building for human habitation. She was building a trap, a labyrinth designed to ensnare and disorient the spirits she believed hunted her. The architectural paradoxes accumulated. Doors opened onto blank walls or sheer drops. Windows looked into other rooms instead of outside. Staircases with 44 steps climbed only 9 feet because each step was only 2 inches high, forcing anyone who climbed them into a slow, meditative ascent that felt more like ritual than transit. Some historians believe these shallow stairs were built to accommodate Sarah's severe arthritis, which worsened as she aged, making normal stairs increasingly painful. Others argue they were spiritual architecture, designed to slow spirits down, to make passage through the house a laborious process that would tire even the dead. The truth may be both. Sarah's physical limitations and her metaphysical fears intersected in the architecture, creating a house that was simultaneously accessible to her failing body and incomprehensible to intruders living or dead. Every night, she held seances in the Blue Room, sometimes alone, sometimes with mediums she imported from San Francisco or Boston. Every morning, she emerged with new plans. A window here, a door there, tear down that wall, build another one 3 feet to the left, move that chimney, add another bathroom, the 13th bathroom. The number appeared everywhere because Sarah believed, based on guidance from the spirits or from numerological texts she studied obsessively, that 13 was a protective number. 13 windows in certain rooms, 13 panels in certain doors, 13 steps on certain staircases, 13 hooks in the Blue Room seance chamber. 13 bathrooms eventually, though not all at once, accumulated through years of construction. Modern psychologists might recognize obsessive-compulsive patterns in this repetition, a need for control expressed through numerical ritual. But for Sarah, the numbers were protective magic, a code that would keep her safe if she could just build it correctly into the structure of the house. The earthquake of 1906 changed everything and nothing. At 5:12 in the morning on April 18th, the San Andreas Fault ruptured along 296 miles of California coastline. In San Francisco, the city burned for 3 days. In San Jose, 30 miles south, the earth convulsed for 45 seconds that felt like hours. The Winchester Mansion, 7 stories of architectural improvisation built without structural engineering oversight, began to collapse. Sarah Winchester was asleep in the Daisy bedroom, a small room she favored in the rear of the house, when the shaking started. The tower, her proudest achievement, the structure that rose highest and could be seen for miles across the valley, folded in on itself like paper. Chimneys fell through roofs. Walls cracked from floor to ceiling. The grand ballroom, which had never hosted a ball, buckled and separated from the main structure. Glass shattered. Plaster dust filled the air. And Sarah, trapped in the Daisy bedroom when a door jammed shut, had to be rescued by servants who pried her out with crowbars. She believed it was a sign from the spirits, not a natural disaster, a message. She had built too high, too visibly, too much like a monument. The spirits did not want grandeur. They wanted confusion. They wanted her to stay hidden, to remain in motion, to never present a fixed target. So she made a decision that defined the mansion's second phase. She sealed off the entire front section of the house, the damaged rooms where the tower had been, and ordered them never opened again. 30 rooms, frozen in time, locked away like a memory too painful to revisit. Furniture remained in place. Dust would accumulate for decades. The rooms became a tomb within the house, a memorial to the moment Sarah Winchester understood that she could not build high enough to escape. Construction resumed within days, even as aftershocks continued to rattle the valley. But now it spread outward, not upward. Horizontal, creeping, consuming the orchards 1 acre at a time. The mansion became a sprawl, a single-story maze that twisted through gardens and greenhouses, servant quarters and storage rooms, each addition as inexplicable as the last. Wings extended in directions that ignored the property lines, forcing Sarah to purchase adjacent lots just to accommodate her expanding construction. By 1910, the mansion covered 6 acres of ground, a warren of interconnected rooms that took hours to walk through from one end to the other. Sarah Winchester had learned her lesson from the earthquake. Stay low, stay hidden, stay moving. The spirits were watching the skies. She would build under their notice. The workers saw things. Of course they saw things. When you build a house for 38 years without stopping, when hammers echo through hallways at 3 in the morning and saws bite through wood in rooms that didn't exist yesterday, when you're working by gaslight and later by flickering electric bulbs that Sarah had installed in 1907, making her one of the first homes in San Jose with electric lighting. Though the system was temperamental and the lights dimmed and surged without apparent cause, you see things. They reported doors slamming in empty wings where no one was working. Footsteps on staircases that led nowhere. The sound of someone climbing steps that had no destination. Cold spots in rooms where no windows existed. Temperature drops of 20 or 30 degrees that had no physical explanation in the mild California climate. Some workers claimed to see Sarah herself wandering the halls in her black morning dress that she wore every day for 38 years, muttering to invisible companions, gesturing at walls as if receiving instructions from empty air. She would appear suddenly in a room where workers were installing a door, watch them in silence for minutes, then leave without speaking. Other times, she would interrupt work to order immediate changes, demanding that a nearly finished wall be torn down and rebuilt 3 inches to the left for reasons she never explained. The workers also heard her playing the pump organ in the grand ballroom at midnight. The same few chords repeated endlessly, as if she were practicing a song she could never quite remember, or as if the song itself was a ritual, a musical seance performed for an audience of ghosts. The organ had been custom built for her, an expensive instrument that she played poorly but persistently. Servants reported that after these midnight sessions, Sarah would sometimes sleep in different bedrooms each night, rotating through dozens of rooms as if trying to avoid being found. She believed the spirits tracked her by habit, that if she established a pattern of sleeping in the same room, they would know where to find her. So she slept in the yellow room one night, the green room the next, the Venetian room after that, a different bed in a different wing, in a house that had more bedrooms than she could use in a month of rotations. But the workers also saw the living costs of the mansion's construction, the human price that accumulated alongside the architectural madness. There were accidents. Men fell from scaffolding when working on high sections of the house before Sarah stopped building upward. Others lost fingers to saws, developed lung diseases from sawdust and paint fumes that filled the workshops and construction areas. Several workers died on the property over the decades, victims of construction accidents or heart attacks or illnesses that were never properly treated because medical care for laborers in the 1890s was minimal at best. No one kept detailed records. Sarah paid well enough and provided doctor visits when injuries occurred, but families didn't complain publicly when someone died. The wages were too good. The work was too steady. The dead were buried quietly. The injured were replaced. Construction continued without pause, without memorial, without acknowledgement. The mansion was built on more than one kind of death, and the workers knew it. Sarah herself became a ghost within her own house, more rumor than presence, more echo than person. She rarely left the property after 1890. Visitors were turned away at the gates by servants instructed to say Mrs. Winchester was not receiving guests. Deliveries were left at service entrances, never handed directly to her. She communicated through intermediaries, primarily her niece, Marion Marriott, who inherited part of Sarah's estate, and her secretary, Henrietta Sievers, who managed the correspondence and business affairs that Sarah couldn't or wouldn't handle herself. These women became the interface between Sarah and the world, translating her wishes, executing her orders, protecting her privacy, with a loyalty that suggests she treated them well, perhaps even affectionately, in ways she could no longer treat the outside world. The newspapers, hungry for stories about eccentric millionaires, especially eccentric women millionaires, called her the Rifle Queen, the Mad Widow, the woman who talked to ghosts. They printed wild estimates of her fortune, speculated about secret rooms filled with gold, Winchester rifles supposedly stored somewhere in the labyrinth, claimed she was building a fortress against the living as much as the dead. They sent reporters who were turned away at the gates. They published sketches of the mansion drawn from descriptions by fired workers or nosy neighbors, none of them accurate. The stories grew wilder over the years. She was a witch. She was a recluse genius. She was planning a vast spiritualist temple. She was hiding something terrible in the sealed rooms. None of it was true. Sarah Winchester was simply a woman who had lost everything, who had been given a narrative by a charlatan medium named Adam Coons, and who had committed to that narrative with the resources and determination to make it real. She was not insane, not in any clinical sense that would have been recognized then or now. She was grieving. And in 19th century America, a wealthy grieving woman was given the space and means to grieve however she chose, as long as she didn't cause scandal or public disturbance. Her daily routine, as described by the few servants who later spoke about their time in her employment, was rigid and ritualistic. She woke late, often not rising until noon after her midnight seances. She took breakfast alone. She spent hours in her greenhouse, tending exotic plants she had shipped from around the world, orchids and ferns that required careful attention. She played the organ. She read extensively, particularly works on spiritualism, numerology, and architecture, filling the mansion's library with books on topics that intersected her obsessions. She met with her foreman each afternoon to discuss the next day's construction, sketching rough plans on paper or describing changes verbally, never once creating a master blueprint that showed the house in its entirety. And every night, at midnight, she entered the blue room for her seances. This routine continued without significant variation for 38 years, a life structured by ritual, insulated by wealth, and defined entirely by the house she was building. The house reflected her mind in ways that become clearer when you examine the details. Orderly in its disorder, methodical in its madness, intentional in its incoherence. Every detail was considered. Every bizarre choice had a reason, even if that reason made sense only within Sarah's private cosmology. The number 13 appeared everywhere, not randomly, but systematically. 13 bathrooms. Eventually, though she started with fewer and added them over years. 13 windows in the 13th bathroom, 13 panels in the front door, 13 steps on the main staircase before it split into two directions. 13 hooks in the seance room where she hung special robes worn during spirit communications. 13 panes in certain windows, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately asymmetrical. She believed the number appeased the spirits, or confused them, or marked safe spaces they wouldn't enter. The origin of this belief is unknown. Numerology texts of the period sometimes treated 13 as powerful, either cursed or blessed depending on the tradition. Sarah chose to treat it as protective and built that protection into every possible surface. Spiderweb motifs appeared throughout the house with similar obsessive frequency. Stained glass windows featured intricate web patterns. Door panels displayed carved webs. Floor tiles arranged themselves in web-like geometries. Sarah told servants that she identified with spiders, creatures that spent their lives building elaborate traps, repairing them daily, waiting patiently in structures of their own making. The metaphor was precise. She was trapped in a web of her own construction, unable to stop building, unable to leave, unable to break the pattern even if she wanted to. The webs were self-portraits in glass and wood and tile. The materials themselves were contradictory, expensive, and refined alongside cheap and crude. Tiffany stained glass windows imported from New York at enormous cost. Parquet floors with intricate inlaid patterns made from rare woods. Gold and silver chandeliers. Hand-carved woodwork by master craftsmen. Indoor plumbing in an era when most homes still used outhouses. Central heating, push-button gas lights and later electric lights throughout. The finest that money could buy. But also, doors 3 feet tall that an adult would have to crawl through. Windows and floors that looked down into rooms below, serving no purpose except to create vertigo. Chimneys that stopped short of the roof, venting into attics instead of outside. Staircases that climbed into ceilings. Storage rooms the size of ballrooms. Ballrooms the size of closets. The mansion was a contradiction, expensive and absurd, beautiful and broken, a testament to what unlimited resources could create when directed by a mind that measured success not in function but in confusion. The total cost was staggering. Sarah spent approximately $5.5 million on construction between 1886 and 1922, roughly $155 million in current value. This figure doesn't include the original property purchase, the furnishings, the maintenance, the staff salaries, or the landscaping. Just construction, just the endless building. At the peak of construction in the 1890s, she was spending $1,000 per day, a sum that would support a working-class family for years, spent instead on walls that would be torn down the next week and rebuilt elsewhere. The fortune from Winchester rifles was immense enough to sustain this expenditure for 38 years without Sarah ever approaching financial distress. She received a monthly income from Winchester Repeating Arms Company stock that exceeded what her workers earned in years. The money was infinite. The building could be infinite until it couldn't. The human cost was never properly calculated, never memorialized, never officially acknowledged. The carpenters, plasterers, gardeners, glassmakers, craftsmen, and laborers who worked in shifts around the clock for nearly 4 decades left few records. They were not authors. They were not diarists. They were working men and women who needed employment and found it in abundance at the Winchester Mansion, but who had neither the time nor the social position to document what it was like to build madness for a living. We know some names from payroll fragments and later interviews. John Hansen, a Swedish carpenter who worked for Sarah for over 20 years, rising to foreman and becoming one of the few people she trusted to interpret her architectural visions. Taijiro Matsumoto, a Japanese gardener who maintained the extensive grounds, the orchards that Sarah insisted be kept producing even as the house consumed more and more acreage, the formal gardens where she walked in the evenings, the greenhouse where she spent hours tending plants. These men saw the mansion grow from farmhouse to sprawl. They watched Sarah age from a 45-year-old widow with dark hair and vigorous energy to an 83-year-old woman, barely 5 feet tall, stooped by arthritis, her hair white, her movements slow and painful, navigating with difficulty through the halls she'd spent a lifetime building. They saw her become the ghost, more absent than present, more legend than person. By 1910, Sarah rarely appeared during daytime construction. She would inspect work at night, moving through the mansion by lamplight, examining joints and measurements, running her hands over finished surfaces to check for smoothness. Workers on night shifts reported these encounters with a mix of fear and pity. She was a haunted woman checking on a haunted house. Both of them incomplete. Both of them never finished. By 1920, Sarah's health had declined to the point where she could no longer climb stairs easily, even the shallow 2-inch steps she designed for herself. She confined herself increasingly to the ground floor, to a circuit of rooms that had become familiar, abandoning the upper reaches of the mansion to dust and silence. The building continued, but she saw less and less of it, trusting her foreman to execute plans she could no longer physically supervise. The workers, for their part, developed a strange loyalty to her and to the project. Despite the strangeness, despite the lack of clear purpose, despite the stories that circulated in San Jose about the mad widow and her haunted mansion, the men who worked for Sarah Winchester often stayed for years or decades. The pay was good, the work was steady, and there was something else, something harder to name, the sense of being part of something unprecedented. They were building a monument to grief, to obsession, to the strange freedom that wealth and isolation could create. No other job would ever be quite like this one. When Sarah Winchester died in 1922, she died in her sleep in a bedroom on the ground floor of the mansion, surrounded by construction that had finally stopped. The foreman who had been preparing the next day's work orders found her servants preparing her body. He dismissed the crews. The carpenters packed their tools for the last time. The servants, many of whom had worked for Sarah for decades, dispersed. The house fell silent for the first time in 38 years. The silence, workers later said, was louder than all the years of hammering. The inventory took 6 weeks and required a team of lawyers, estate administrators, and specialists to catalog. What they documented was staggering in its specificity and its incoherence. 160 rooms. Though the exact count depended on how you defined a room, since many spaces had unclear boundaries or multiple purposes. 10,000 windows, many of them looking into other rooms, creating a cascade of reflected light that made navigation even more disorienting. 2,000 doors, hundreds of which led nowhere or opened onto walls or drops. 47 fireplaces, most of them functional, some of them decorative, a few of them sealed up behind walls during renovations and only rediscovered during the inventory. 40 staircases, many leading nowhere, several folding back on themselves, a few climbing into solid ceilings. 6 kitchens in different wings of the house, suggesting Sarah had originally planned to run different sections independently, though she lived alone and employed only a dozen or so live-in servants at any given time. 13 bathrooms, the number she had obsessively worked toward. 3 elevators, luxury items in the early 20th century, installed so Sarah could move between floors as her arthritis worsened. 2 basements, though their extent was unclear because some sections had been sealed or flooded. Thousands of feet of hallways that doubled back, intersected, and terminated in walls. And in Sarah's bedroom safe, they found only 2 items: a lock of her daughter Annie's baby hair, still soft and golden after 43 years, preserved in a small envelope labeled in Sarah's handwriting, and her husband William's obituary, clipped from the New Haven newspaper in 1881, creased and worn from being folded and refolded. No gold. No hidden Winchester rifles. No mysterious documents revealing the house's purpose. Just grief, preserved behind an expensive lock, in an expensive safe, in an expensive house that had been built to contain it and failed. The simplicity of those 2 items, in a mansion of such overwhelming complexity, was perhaps the clearest statement of what the house had always been: an elaborate casket for 2 memories that could have fit in a pocket. No blueprints were ever found, no master plans, no architectural drawings showing the house in its entirety. Sarah had worked from memory and midnight visions for 38 years, building a structure so complex that even she probably couldn't navigate it entirely without getting lost. The house existed as process, not product. Its meaning was in the building, not in being built. Now that the building had stopped, the house became immediately historical, a relic of a time and a mindset that was already passing into legend. The estate was appraised at $5.5 million, the exact amount Sarah had spent on construction, a perfect circle of expenditure that left her heirs with property but not with profit. The mansion itself was deemed worthless, except as a curiosity. No one wanted to live in it. No one could afford to maintain it. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company, now run by distant relatives who barely knew Sarah, had no interest in the property. It was sold at auction in 1923 to a group of investors who recognized its only possible value as a tourist attraction. They paid $135,000, less than 3% of what Sarah had spent building it, a discount that reflected the market's assessment of a house designed for ghosts. The Winchester Mystery House, as it was immediately branded, opened to the public within months of purchase. Guided tours were offered daily. Postcards were printed. Newspaper advertisements promised thrills and chills in the mansion built by spirits. The house that Sarah had built to hide from the world became a spectacle, her privacy invaded posthumously by thousands of paying strangers who walked her hallways and climbed her stairs and stared at her bizarre architectural choices with a mixture of amusement and pity. The legacy is complicated and has been reinterpreted through successive generations, each finding different meanings in the same architectural madness. Early 20th century accounts portrayed Sarah Winchester as a cautionary tale about the dangers of spiritualism, a wealthy woman exploited by charlatans and driven to madness by grief. Mid-century interpretations, influenced by psychoanalysis, read the house as a physical manifestation of mental illness, a three-dimensional diagram of a fractured psyche. Feminist historians in the late 20th century began to reframe Sarah Winchester not as a madwoman, but as a woman exercising agency in the only way her era allowed. Wealthy beyond most women's dreams, educated at the Young Ladies Collegiate Institute in New Haven, but barred from business leadership, from public life, from any role except widow and heiress, she channeled her resources into construction as a form of control, of purpose, of daily ritual that kept despair at bay. The seances may have been real to her, genuine spiritual experiences that gave her comfort and direction. Or they may have been theater, a performance that justified the only thing that gave her life meaning, the act of building itself. The truth is probably somewhere between these extremes. Sarah was intelligent enough to know that her architectural choices looked absurd from the outside. She was also isolated enough not to care. The seances gave her authority over her own life in a society that granted women very little authority. By claiming spiritual guidance, she made herself untouchable. No one could question her decisions if those decisions came from the dead. The mansion became a fortress of justified eccentricity, protected by wealth and widowhood and the strange permission American society gave to grieving women to be left alone. The house was not a haunted house in any supernatural sense. It was a workshop, a studio, a canvas on which Sarah Winchester painted her interior life for 38 years. That the result was chaos is less a sign of madness than a reflection of what trauma does to the architecture of self. You build, you rebuild, you try to contain the damage. You fail. You keep building anyway, because building is better than stillness, because motion is better than reflection, because as long as the hammers are falling and the saws are singing, you don't have to sit alone with the silence that contains all your losses. The mansion was Sarah's way of never being still, of never having to face the unchangeable fact that Annie was dead and William was dead, and no amount of construction could bring them back. The spirits she built for were not the vengeful dead from Winchester rifles. They were her daughter and her husband, and the house was not a defense against them, but a monument to them, a structure so elaborate and endless that it could match the size of her grief. But the Winchester Mystery House also reflects the violence on which it was built, and no amount of psychological reframing can erase that foundation. The Winchester rifle reshaped warfare and frontier violence on a massive scale. Historians agree that Winchester rifles played a major role in large-scale violence across the American frontier, but the true number of deaths is impossible to quantify. What we know for certain is the scope of destruction. The Winchester Model 1873, the gun that won the West, was the most popular rifle in American history. It killed buffalo by the millions, wiping out herds that had sustained indigenous peoples for millennia, destroying entire ecosystems to clear land for cattle ranching and agriculture. It armed settlers who pushed westward under the doctrine of manifest destiny, killing Lakota and Apache and Comanche and dozens of other tribes whose names are now attached to sports teams and forgotten battles. It armed both sides of the Civil War, sold without allegiance to whoever could pay, turning brother against brother with industrial efficiency. It traveled to Cuba during the Spanish-American War, to the Philippines during the colonization that followed, to Mexico during the Revolution, to anywhere men wanted to kill at distance with reliability and speed. Indigenous peoples across the Americas had a name for the Winchester 1873, the spirit gun, or sometimes the gun that speaks twice, referring to the sound of the lever action chambering a new round. To the Lakota at Wounded Knee in 1890, to the Apache in the Arizona territories, to the Nez Perce during their attempted flight to Canada, the sound of that lever was the sound of death arriving in waves, unstoppable, inevitable. Sarah Winchester inherited wealth built on this particular kind of dying, systematic and at scale. The fortune that funded her mansion came from the same source that funded the destruction of entire ways of life. And while Sarah personally bore no responsibility for what her father-in-law Oliver Winchester and her husband William had built, while she had no direct role in the company's decisions or sales, she also never questioned the source of her wealth. She never divested. She never used her fortune, vast and influential, to oppose the rifle trade or to support the peoples it had devastated. She built a house instead. The spirits she feared, if they existed, were not fooled by architecture. The irony is precise and cruel. Sarah Winchester spent 38 years building a maze to confuse and trap vengeful spirits. But she never considered that the actual ghosts, the actual dead who might have claim on her conscience, were not confused at all. They knew exactly where she was. They knew the mansion. They knew the orchards planted on Ohlone land. They knew the fortune that paid for Tiffany glass and gold chandeliers and hand-carved doors. The Chinese laborers who likely worked on the house, unnamed and unrecorded in the archives, products of the same racist exclusion that led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The dead workers from construction accidents, the Ohlone whose land the property occupied, the thousands upon thousands killed by Winchester rifles in wars and massacres and quiet individual murders that never made newspapers. These ghosts, if they walked the halls of the Winchester Mansion, had more right to be there than Sarah ever did. You cannot build your way out of complicity. You cannot confuse guilt with architecture. The spirits, if they existed, were not fooled. Today, the Winchester Mystery House draws thousands of visitors each year. They walk the crooked hallways and climb the stairs to nowhere and marvel at the eccentricity of it all, the beautiful strangeness, the Gilded Age excess repurposed as entertainment. Tour guides tell Sarah's story with a mix of sympathy and spectacle, framing her as a tragic figure or a cunning businesswoman or a victim of spiritualist fraud, depending on the audience. But what the tourists rarely confront is what the house actually represents. A woman who spent 4 decades trying to build a structure strong enough to hold her grief, and failed because grief cannot be structured. It leaks through walls. It climbs through ceilings. It finds you in the locked rooms, and the sealed corridors, and the staircases that go nowhere. Sarah Winchester built 160 rooms, and in every single one, she was alone. The mansion still stands, renovated and preserved, a historical landmark and a profitable business. The orchards are gone, replaced by suburban sprawl and tech campuses. San Jose is now Silicon Valley, where new fortunes are made and new questions about wealth and morality are ignored in favor of disruption and innovation. The Winchester Mystery House is a relic, a curiosity, a reminder of a stranger time when grief was indulged rather than medicated, when a woman could spend a fortune on madness and be left alone to do it. But it is also a mirror. We build our own labyrinths now. We construct our own meaningless additions. We throw money at problems that cannot be solved with money, and we call it progress, or therapy, or self-care, or investment. The house is still teaching the same lesson. Sarah Winchester learned too late. There is no architecture of atonement. There is only the building, and the building never stops. The question that haunts the Winchester Mystery House is not whether it's haunted. The question is what we choose to build when we're trying to escape ourselves. Sarah Winchester chose confusion, complexity, endless motion. She believed that if she could just keep adding rooms, keep shifting walls, keep the hammers ringing and the saws singing, she could outrun the dead. She could not. The dead were always inside. They were the memory of her daughter's face. They were her husband's last breath. They were the countless strangers killed by the product that made her rich. They were the workers who built the mansion and died unknown. They were the land itself, stolen and sold and built upon without acknowledgement. Ghosts are not supernatural. Ghosts are unresolved history. And the Winchester Mystery House is full of history that will never resolve. On quiet days, when the tours have ended and the lights are low, staff report the same phenomena the workers described a century ago. Footsteps, doors, cold spots, the sound of a pump organ playing in an empty ballroom. Maybe it's Sarah. Maybe it's the house settling, wood and nails and glass adjusting to the weight of 140 years. Maybe it's the imagination of people who work in a place marketed as haunted. Or maybe it's the truth the mansion was built to contain, that some things cannot be built around. Some things cannot be confused. Some things cannot be escaped. Grief finds you, history finds you, the dead find you. Not because they're malevolent, but because they're part of you. Sarah Winchester spent 38 years building a house to keep the dead out. She died inside it, surrounded by the architecture of her own fear. The mansion is her monument. The labyrinth is her legacy. And the lesson, if we're willing to learn it, is that the only way out of the maze is to stop building it.